My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our post-election day wrap-up. There's apparently a lot of interest. It was a late night for many of us last night. We have a great panel. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. They'll each take about 10 minutes or so for some preliminary remarks, and we're going to throw it open to Q&A. So our first speaker today is John Wilkerson. John is the Donald R. Matthews Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington and Director of the Center for American Politics and Public Policy. You're also the chair of the department over there, right? How many hats do you have? He teaches congressional politics and research methods. His most recent book, Congress and the Politics of Problem Solving, investigates how Congress has tried to design its institutions to promote better policy decisions. Take it away, John.
Thanks. So,
you want to sit up here?
Is there a clicker or Richard was fine?
There's a clicker right there.
See if I get the right direction. No?
Is that not working?
Not working. Okay, thanks for having me, Cornell, once again. It's a pleasure to come out to the other Washington. I have a limited amount of time to talk here, which is probably good for you. But I wanted to make a couple of key points from political science perspective on this. So I'm going to talk about some forecasting models and what those forecasting models predicted versus what the outcome was, and how I would understand the differences. And so my 2 cents are essentially that this election really was a referendum on Donald Trump, at least at the national level. It was going to be a really bad election from the Republicans' perspective, but I think the reason it wasn't as bad as they expected it to be was that Trump played such an active role in preserving Republican support by getting out his base. So not surprising, but I think what I want to show you here is how the models seem to suggest and support that. And what's interesting to me as a political scientist is when I was in graduate school, there was an article by another political scientist called Gary Jacobson, where he was taking these forecasting models, which made it look like in 1982 it was going to be a really bad year for Republicans. So this was Ronald Reagan's first midterm election, and the economy wasn't doing well, and so all the models said the Republicans were going to get hammered. And Gary Jacobson had the guts to actually publish an article before the election saying it's not going to be as bad as everyone predicted. And his reason was, he said, the Republicans aren't behaving the way the president's party has historically behaved in the past. Specifically, instead of saying, oh, we're going to get creamed because the economy is so bad, they ignored that. They managed to recruit high-quality candidates, they managed to raise a lot of money, and as a result, they were able to significantly stem the losses versus what the models predicted in terms of how many seats they would lose in the House. And I think that's what happened in this election, essentially, that this election should have been a really bad election given Trump's unpopularity. That's what our models would tell us, but it turned out to be less bad for the Republicans than expected because of all of the hard work the Republicans did to try to stem those losses. So this is the story. This is what we're trying to predict in terms of the models. So what we've got here is essentially how many seats does the president's party gain in the House, right, during midterm election years, right? So you have a presidential election year in 2016, you have a midterm election year in 2018. Typically, the president's party loses House seats in midterm election years, right, as we're all aware. And how much they lose varies over time. And so what political scientists have tried to do is develop statistical models to predict, for the most part, right, the size of the loss that the president's party is going to suffer in midterm election years. Okay? And there are lots of different models, and so I just want to talk about a couple of them. So one is Ray Fair's model, and so Ray Fair is an economist at Yale, and he spent a lot of time developing very sophisticated statistical models that have lots of different variables in them. And in particular, he's interested in the state of the economy and its impact on midterm loss for the president's party. So he has a bunch of economic variables in his model, and then he has a bunch of information about the context. So, you have a president who's serving in his first term, his second term, and that sort of thing. But significantly, Ray Fair's model doesn't have anything in it about presidential approval. Okay? And so if you take Ray Fair's model and you apply it to the current election, what you get is it predicts that Democrats will get 50%, slightly over 50% of the national vote in the 2018 elections, right? And so just barely more than 50% of the national vote. He doesn't predict seats, he just predicts national vote, and so we have to translate that to explain the graph previously. We've got to translate the vote into seats, and we can do that with Nate Silver's model. So Nate Silver is the person who runs 538.com. Essentially what he does is he says, well, here's the popular vote margin. Given the popular vote margin historically, what would we expect in terms of the number of seats that would be held by the Democrats versus the Republican House, right? And so this is Ray Fair's prediction. And according to that, for Nate Silver's model, which would essentially say that the Republicans are not going to lose any seats in this election at all. In fact, they're going to pick up seats in the House based on Ray Fair's model. Okay? Nate Silver's model, on the other hand, predicts that the Democrats are going to get about 57% of the vote, and that predicts that they're going to pick up seats in the House, right, on the order of about 35 seats. Okay, so Fair's model is saying this is going to be a good election for Republicans, right? And the reason it's going to be a good election is because the economy is doing so well. I mean, his model weights economic conditions, and in fact, the economy is doing so well. So kind of weird, huh? So here's another model. This is Edward Tufte's model. And essentially, he's trying to explain the same variation in midterm loss over time, but he has just two variables, right? One variable is change in real per capita income, essentially a measure of how well the economy is doing. And he's got presidential approval, right? So the difference between the two models is presidential approval, fundamentally, right? And what's important about that is President Trump's presidential approval is low, right? It's on the order of 41% or something like that. So when you introduce that variable into the model, right, essentially what you've got is a model where you're going to say, what's the percent growth in per capita real disposable income, what's the president's approval, that will predict how many seats the president's party is going to lose. And what you get is, in this model, Republicans are going to lose 38 seats in the current election. Okay? So this model predicts more seat losses than actually occurred, right? Because it incorporates presidential approval into the model, right? So what I take from this is essentially, if we incorporate presidential approval, essentially, what do you think of Trump? We predict much greater losses than if we just considered the state of the economy. So this really was an election about Donald Trump. Okay? But if you look at how many seats the Republicans actually lost in the House, it wasn't 38 seats, it wasn't 35 seats that Nate Silver predicted, right? It was more on the order of looking like around 27 seats right now, right? And so I think, my thesis is that when Trump went out, did sort of defy the conventional wisdom, became extremely controversial in terms of its message and that sort of thing, it really made a positive impact for the Republican Party. And right now he's talking about how he saved the Republican Party, and I guess I would agree with him on that. And it was also quite extraordinary in the Senate how the Democrats were actually, it wasn't a good year for the Democrats in the Senate. But the fact that the Democrats actually lost 2 seats in the Senate was, that was a significant victory for the Republicans as well, too. And then why did the Republicans do so well in the Senate? Well, this is one other final piece of information I thought I would share. So this is when the Kavanaugh hearings were held, And this is the forecast in terms of the Democrats' chance of controlling the Senate versus the Republicans. And you can see here that the Kavanaugh hearings had a really positive impact for Republicans in the Senate races, right? So strategically, there was strategy involved. That seems to have been a pretty bad decision on the part of the Democrats. But of course, that's not the only reason for bringing up the product. In the House, you don't see the same effect. You see a temporary blip from the Kavanaugh hearings, but then it sort of goes away. So the Kavanaugh hearings didn't seem to have much of an impact in House races, but it does seem to have had an impact in Senate races. That's what I've got.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So our next speaker is Mark Stephan, who is one of my colleagues over on the Vancouver campus in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. He's an associate professor there. His research is in the area of environmental information policy disclosure and citizens' involvement in environmental decision-making. In 2011, he co-authored the award-winning book, Coming Clean, Information Disclosure and Environmental Performance. Take it away.
Thank you. And can I take it from right here?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, given that that quick introduction from Cornell, you might wonder why the heck I'm actually talking on a midterms election results panel. And the main reason is because my research focuses on states. I'm really interested in states and comparisons across states. I'm very interested in governors and state legislatures, and that's really what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to start talking about that in terms of yesterday's results, in terms of one state in particular, Pennsylvania. And I'm actually not going to talk about the state legislature or the governor in Pennsylvania. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that the Democrats picked up 3 seats from Republicans in the state yesterday. They did so partly for some of the reasons that John just talked about, but also because there was a recent redistricting that occurred because of court action in Pennsylvania. The state was forced, Republicans in fact in charge were forced to make some changes, in particular with some of the districts around the Philadelphia area and around the state. And that's at least one of the components that went into Democrats doing well in Pennsylvania and picking up 3 seats. Well, why do I talk about that? Well, because states, governors, and legislatures are the ones who are so critical when it comes to redistricting. We're coming up on 2020, and in fact, what the sort of balance of Republican and Democratic states is, both in the legislative side of the House and also in the governorship, really matters. The basic answer in terms of governors, and we'll start there, is they did well, but not as well as I think many Democrats hoped they would. They picked up 7 seats around the country, at least 2 of which I would assume that Democrats in those states were ecstatic. The state of Wisconsin, where Scott Walker lost his race, his incumbent race, and some are cheering into the room. And in the state of Kansas, where the Democrats won the governorship, and that was a big deal there as well, because Kansas is generally speaking a very conservative state. It's been in many ways a bellwether for conservatism in the country, and the fact that a Democrat won there was a pretty big deal. They lost, as I think many of you know, the Democrats lost in Florida. That was a big race they were hoping to pick up, but they did not. This does shift things back towards Democrats overall across the 50 states. So now we're in a situation where there are 23 Democrats running the states as governors around the country and 27 Republicans. Still, it leans Republican in that regard, but has moved the Democrats' direction. You combine that with a few chamber switches in the legislative bodies around the country, including New Hampshire, that went from entirely Republican control of both their House and their state Senate to Democratic control of the two. That also sort of shifts things slightly towards the Democrats. But historically, that wasn't great performance. And maybe that, as much as that may not be the thing that most people are focusing on right now nationally and in the media, is one to keep your eye on. Why was it that at the national level, in particular in the House, Democrats were able to do so well, but they weren't able to make bigger shifts at the state legislative level? At least part of what's going on, as some of the analysts out there are pointing at, is that there is now a more sort of solidification of Republican and Democratic control in different states. Let me put it this way. Right now, except for the state of Minnesota, where the chambers are split, one chamber is held by the Democrats and one by the Republicans, every other legislative body is either held by one party or the other. That shift, that continued shift towards solid red all the way down to the state legislative level is something that's been playing out over time, but it's solidifying the idea that we've had for a while of red and blue states. I think, again, as many of you know, a lot of states are really purple, you know, when we start looking at the details at the county level or district level. But they're arguably today a little bit less purple than they were yesterday. There's more of a hardening of lines within states and across states that really matters. That was the main thing, the main sort of data that I wanted to get across. I had one more sort of key thing to mention that's a little bit closer to home. And again, it's not exactly about a governor or a governor's race, but it relates to a governor. Here in the state of Washington, the voters voted down an initiative for a carbon fee, basically a carbon tax. The initiative 1631. That surprised a number of people, but it wasn't entirely a surprise. It was understood that it was going to be pretty well split. But as I told my students last week, my prediction had been not that necessarily it would win, but that it likely would. And that our governor, Governor Inslee, would then be able to use this to help cement the argument that he is the climate change governor, and that would help propel him toward the decision that many think he is going to make to run for president. The fact that the initiative didn't go in that direction in a very blue state overall raises questions about that. Now, it doesn't mean that he won't run. I'm not saying he has said he's going to run, but I think there's some suggestion of that. And the state, the voters have gone in a different direction in that regard. There's more to say about governor's races, about some of these state legislative races as well, and I hope to, during Q&A if there's an interest in that. But those were the key things that I wanted to make sure to get across.
All right, thanks, Mark. So our final panelist is Travis Ridout, who's the Thomas S. Foley Distinguished Professor of Government and Public Policy here at WSU. He's also one of my colleagues in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. He also serves as the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project, which tracks political advertising. His research on political campaigns, political advertising, and campaign finance has appeared in several journal articles and book chapters. Travis's most recent book is Political Advertising in the United States. It was published in 2016. Travis.
All right, thank you, Cornell. So, let's say last Friday you went to all those websites for the prognosticators and the forecasters and Nate Silver and the CNN forecast and all of that, and the results you got yesterday were exactly what those websites predicted. Not really a surprise at all. The polls did really, 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 really well in these 2018 midterms. Now, I'm sure Democrats are sad that Beto O'Rourke did not win in Texas, but the polls said he was behind, and he ended up losing by 3 percentage points. And Republicans are sad that they lost the House, but every reasonable forecast out there said that Republicans were going to lose the House and probably between 30 and 40 seats. And once the counting is done in California and in this state, they will have lost between 30 and 40 states in the House of Representatives. So that's my first point. Second, I think the laws of elections still apply. Donald J. Trump may be a unique president. He didn't rewrite the rules. The president's party loses seats in midterm elections in the House, and that happened this year. His party did gain a few seats in the Senate. Sometimes that happens. as was pointed out, that was fought on some very red turf this year. What happened yesterday in the Senate, not a surprise at all. Second, I want to focus a little bit more on where these Democratic gains came from. To some extent, they were all over the place, although they did seem concentrated in the suburbs of big cities. Some are calling these Romney-Clinton districts because Romney won them in 2012, but Clinton won them in 2016. But they also picked up 2 of Iowa's 4 seats, very rural state. Picked up some districts that are racially and ethnically diverse. Failed to pick up some districts that are racially and ethnically diverse. Many of the winners in the House on the Democratic side seem to be mainstream Democrats, not particularly progressive, not particularly firebrands. The candidates that the media got really excited about, O'Rourke and Gillum in Florida, of course, did not win. Last night had huge implications for redistricting in 2020. Democrats are in a much better place than they were in 2010 in terms of redistricting, though they're not in the place that they'd like to be. If we look at some of the biggest states in the country, Michigan last night passed a ballot measure that will institute nonpartisan redistricting in that state. It was heavily gerrymandered by Republicans after 2010. Ohio earlier this year passed redistricting reform that still allows for some partisanship, but is going to be less partisan than in the past. Wisconsin elected a Democratic governor. Pennsylvania re-elected its Democratic governor and has a Supreme Court that cares a lot about fair redistricting. Missouri passed nonpartisan redistricting yesterday. You know who's in charge now? It's the state demographer is in charge of redistricting in Missouri, and the state demographer is required to use statistical criteria in redistricting in that state. Now, there will be huge Republican gerrymanders in Georgia, assuming the Republican wins the governor's race, and it's looking like that's going to happen, though it may go to a runoff. Expect a huge Republican gerrymander in Florida. Expect a huge Republican gerrymander in Texas. North Carolina, it's going to depend on who wins the governor's race in 2020. There's currently a Democratic governor who will be running for re-election. Illinois elected a Democratic governor. Expect a huge Democratic gerrymander just like they did after 2010. So, huge implications for redistricting. My fourth point is that the racial and gender and demographic divide between the Democratic and the Republican Party is getting wider. The one African American Republican woman in the House of Representatives looks like she lost her seat. There were 2 Cuban American Republicans in Congress who, one of them got defeated, one of them did not run for re-election. There will be at least 84 Democratic women in the U.S. House, and at least 12 Republican women in the House. And so that gender split between the parties got even greater last night. My final point is that impeachment of President Trump is very, very unlikely in the next 2 years. Trump, I think, was a drag on Republicans in some places, but not enough of a drag for his party to turn against him, or for many members of his party to turn against him. And in order to successfully impeach and remove from office a president, you need your party to turn against you. In fact, several moderate Republicans got defeated yesterday by Democrats because they were representing moderate districts. And the Senate is more Trumpy than it was before these elections. Think about Tennessee. Senator Bob Corker, who sometimes feuded with Donald Trump, was a critic sometimes. He's being replaced by Marsha Blackburn, who loves President Trump. And I could give other examples of that as well. So those are my big takeaways from election night.
Okay, thanks, Travis. So we have about a half an hour for some discussion and Q&A. Let me start this off. So do any of you see any sort of longer-term realignments taking place or evidence of it from this particular midterm that might carry over into 2020 or 2022 or 2024? And I'm thinking in particular, if you look at, there's a number of states people have been saying are, turning purple, but really haven't until perhaps last night. So I'm thinking about Texas, for instance, Arizona, for instance, Nevada, Colorado. Those all seem to be real purple states last night, even though in the end, Democrats may or may not win any of those, but they're very close races. So do you see any kind of real realignment that's redrawing the map, the battlefield for the parties?
You want to go ahead?
I'll start. So I think one of the positive impacts of this election for Democrats was all of the efforts they did to mobilize voters, to register voters, right? So even though they lost in the cruise race in Texas,
Although they also picked up some House seats.
they did pick up
In
some.
Texas.
So I think they are changing the dynamics of politics in Texas over the longer term if they can sustain that motivation. And I think they were close in a lot of respects this time around, and so I would think that momentum would carry over into the next election as well.
Travis doesn't think so.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of realignment. I don't know. There's certainly slow movement in particular states. I think the success that Democrats had in retaining Senate seats in the Midwest and winning governor seats in some of those upper Midwest states that ended up going for Trump suggests that Democrats will not write those off, and in fact they may be key to a Democratic presidential victory in 2020. So, but as far as a major realignment, I don't know. I mean, you are seeing a movement of a realignment on the basis of education, where better educated people are now much more Democratic than they were in the past, and less educated people are far more Republican. I don't know if that's, long term or a Trump phenomenon.
Okay. Yeah, back here, Matt.
So, as a rural sociologist, I have a certain skepticism about models in general and political science models in particular. I tend to look at this through a cultural lens, and in that sense, I'm not at all surprised that the Senate picked up seats because the rural-urban differences that our pollster talked to us a month ago here, Stuart Elway, about, seems to be played out in the Senate race beautifully, or ugly yesterday, depending on how you look at it. My question, though, to the political scientists on the panel is, it seems to me that one of the things that your field debates a lot is whether demographics and economics are destiny on the one hand, or does the message and the campaign strategy matter? And I'm thinking of Beto. There was an article critical of him in Politico a couple days ago saying he went so far to the extreme of pulling out new voters, and he did pull out a bunch of new voters, that he ignored disaffected Republicans who really didn't like Cruz. And if he had just made some effort and maybe done some more TV advertising, because they watch TV, they don't go on the internet, that he might have actually pulled together a better coalition and actually won. So using maybe that as an example, but it seems to me, I'd like to know the more general idea of, do campaigns matter, do messages matter, or is it all demographics and economics?
This is the difference between sociology and political science. Parsimony of models versus...
Exactly.
Okay.
I'll give an initial reaction to that, which is that campaigns matter when they matter. right?
Right on.
Or to put it another way, basically campaigns, I mean, I'll argue that campaigns don't matter much, but particular circumstances where there is some level of competition already between the two parties can give some marginal effect to campaigns, but very marginal effect. I say that at the same time that I want to comment really quickly on the Texas race, because the difference between Beto and Ted Cruz was 3%, right? The difference between the two candidates for the governor's race was 14%. He did something in particular in his race that was different than what was being done, obviously, for other Democrats or in other statewide Democrats. So I'm sort of ignoring my own point in a sense, or denying my own point. So I'll leave it at that.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, so models, there are lots of different kinds of models. Some are more complex than others, right? So if you look at 538.com, they bring in all sorts of stuff, right? They'll bring in polling data and those sorts of things. What's appealing to a model for me as a political scientist is how, you know, we can learn about general factors and how they influence patterns over time and that sort of thing. So I'm not trying to explain what happened in any particular race. I'm more interested in sort of what are we learning more generally about the dynamics of congressional elections and that sort of thing. And I think the way to think about the sort of these factors that you're raising, right, so the idiosyncratic features of particular races, is these models are essentially saying, you know, those things tend to cancel out. Yeah, you get some Democrats who are particularly good campaigners, and you get some Republicans who are particularly good campaigners, right? And so you may not be able to do a very good job of predicting any one race, right? But on average, you should be doing a pretty good job of predicting things. So they're not saying that context doesn't matter, right? But they're not trying to explain things at that level, right? As political scientists, we're not Stuart Elway, right? Stuart Elway is, he can do a good job of predicting what's going to happen in that race. My model can't do a good job of predicting what's going to happen in that race.
So do these models deal at all with the sort of cultural anger that exists between rural and urban nowadays?
Oh, that's a terrific question. So the models I talked about here, the answer is simply no, right? These are assuming, well, you know, these are assuming it's fundamentally about, the midterm elections are fundamentally about economics, right? And then historically, presidential approval has been correlated with the state of the economy, right? And so this is a really weird election in that respect, right, where it's not. And so I guess that's my answer.
Okay. Up here.
What happened in Eastern Washington?
And why did it happen?
Something specific, or do you want me to talk
Well,
about
actually, what I'd really like to know
or-
is, this is the same district that elected Foley, and it now can't seem to elect another Democrat. Well, is there something inherent going on, or is there a chance that a Democrat's ever going to be able to come back?
Well, I think there's always a chance, but I think we are more polarized than we were, what, 40, 50 years ago when Tom Foley was first elected to this House seat, and he had the advantage of incumbency that kept him in office in a very conservative district for a very long time until that dam broke in 1994. And at that point, you kind of had a clean slate, and a conservative Republican district is electing conservatives and Republicans. So, yeah.
And then I would add, the other variable there is you have an incumbent, right? So Catherine Rogers has incumbency advantage. And so she had a very high quality and well-known challenger with a lot of money and that sort of thing. And so that's, you know, it was a relatively close race for that reason. But if this would have been an open seat race where you didn't have an incumbent running, then the outcome might have been different.
So that explains the difference with the 8th district versus, but what about the difference between the 3rd and the 5th? Because both of those arguably should have been red seats, incumbents in both cases. Both, arguably in the 5th congressional district, you had a more qualified challenger who raised more money overall in the end. And yet the 3rd is very close, and the 5th wasn't close at all.
I'm sorry, were we talking about the 8th or the 5th just now?
I'm talking about the third and the 5th.
Okay. So
Yeah.
was I responding the right, was I
Yeah,
responding?
yeah. No, you were, yeah.
Yeah, something after the third. Yeah, I mean, incumbency, still matters, right? But, and probably will in terms of the final outcome when the final count comes down. But, I mean, I'll say something, the person running, the Democrat running in their district is my colleague, our colleague. And so, I've got to sort of put that to the side. But I would say that the incumbent didn't seem very energetic in her desire to win the race. That's sort of bluntly my sort of perspective about that. So going back to the campaign question, do campaigns matter? I think that what won the race and that what likely has won the race, we don't have a final outcome there, for the incumbent is incumbency and the fact that it's a more conservative district after the 2010 redistricting that occurred. But it's not about, on the other side, a huge amount of money raised, a huge amount of energy put into that campaign. And I think I would say that Carolyn Long is the Beto O'Rourke of Southwest Washington. In the sense of that sort of intensity.
Yeah. The campaigns mattered a lot in comparing those two districts, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering how much any of you have been following voter turnout, because of course there was this prediction that we'd have this increase in voter turnout, and increase in voter turnout is like 48%, of course. But anyway, I was just wondering if you were following it, and also, do any of the models take into consideration voter turnout? Because it's kind of it's the big elephant in the room, pretty much, on midterms.
Yeah. So, I haven't seen much in the way of statistics on turnout in this election yet. I heard Washington State was 70%. If that's the case, that's kind of incredible. Yeah. And so once again, the models, they don't account for turnout. So you have the variables that you manipulate in the model, and then you have all the other things that are behind the scenes in the model that you assume sort of balance out. Right? So they're just noise. They cancel, all those other things cancel each other out, and the things that matter are state of the economy and where the population. So I guess I would expect that that's what happened in this race, as well as you had high turnout on both sides, and to some extent that ended up canceling itself.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily trust the early numbers on this, but everyone agrees turnout was way up this year over our last midterm elections in 2014. In fact, there are some congressional districts in which turnout was higher in 2018 than in 2016, the presidential election year. I believe there was some in Georgia, where you can find that, some in Texas as well. So we definitely know that turnout was up, which I think was to Democrats' advantage, because at least in the past few midterms, they've had much less turnout than Republicans have, and we matched them this time around.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, so real quick, I would say that, once again, I'll argue that there's going to be some interesting variation across states in terms of turnout, and that, some states had a lot more turnout to sort of bring forth because their turnout is so low in midterm years, whereas in other states, like Washington State, it's already pretty high by national standards, and so yeah, I may see some bump up, but I think Georgia, Texas, I think there's a few states that will see much larger numbers, and that's part of the dynamic in those places.
Hey, back here, yeah.
So I was kind of wondering, has there been trends for this notion? I'm not an Americanist, so I don't study this, so if it's a dumb question, I apologize. But it seems last night, there were a decent number of conservative candidates that were running far to the right, at least away from center, either with Trump support or not, and they won. Yet we had Democrat candidates who were running progressive campaigns further from the left from center, and they lost. What is it, if that's true, that allows Republican candidates to run further away from the center and win, but maybe not in the inverse for Democrats?
Well, it's in some places, I think the explanation is pretty simple. In some of these Senate races, let's say Tennessee, you've got a lot more Republicans than Democrats. Just make sure all the Republicans show up to vote, then a Republican wins. So you don't have to move to the middle to try to attract the independent voter, the persuadable voter. You just get your base to show up to the polls.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about it after this election was the median voter theorem is dead, in effect. So this is a theory where what you have to do to win an election is you have to win the middle voter in the district, right? Because that gives you a majority in the district, right? And so that implies that if you have candidates of two parties, right, both of them need to move to the center and fight over that moderate voter in the middle, right? And that's not what this election was about in many districts, right? This election was about turnout, right, of your base, right? And to get your base excited, you had to move away from the middle, right, rather than towards the middle. And so that, I think we talk about political science models. There's a model where I think we need to be asking serious questions about, to what extent does this explain American politics today?
Aside from infrastructure, do any of you see any potential for the Democrats to work with the president on any type of policy over the next 2 years? It's difficult for me to imagine him acquiescing on anything substantial for space like immigration. I'm just trying to imagine what can happen policy-wise in the next 2 years.
The one thing that comes to mind is actually sometimes Democrats on trade policy are a little bit closer to the president's arguments of late than Republicans. Many Republicans are. That's a possibility. But here's the thing, right? So this is the struggle for House Democrats and then for the Republican Party in the Senate and the president is, are we going to try to score policy points that maybe have eventual political gain to them, or are we just going to score, just focus on the political points? And if we're just going to focus on the political points for 2 years, don't do anything, right? Versus if you think that there's something to be gained in incremental ways, policy-wise, that does have political gain long-term, maybe you make that deal.
I have difficulty imagining that Democrats will be able to help themselves. They're not going to be able to stay away from so many of these scandals. There's so much paper trail. With so much of this stuff, I just feel like it's going to be difficult for them to control their members and not investigate all of this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
Two of the speakers spoke to the role of the president in the actual elections. John, you said that the president deserves credit for making things less bad than they could have been, whereas Travis talked about the president being a drag on the Republican Party. I was wondering if you all would be willing to talk more about those ideas, like how they communicate with each other.
Right. I guess my position is, in midterm elections, when the president has higher approval, the president's party doesn't lose as many seats. Trump historically has fairly low approval, around 41%. And that's why I consider him a drag on the party. Now, here's the thought exercise. Let's say it were a generic Republican who were president right now, or say it was President Marco Rubio or President Jeb Bush, who had 41% approval. Would the Republican Party have done worse in those House races or worse in those Senate races with a President Jeb Bush at 41% approval? I'm not sure they would have. I don't know.
With the Jeff Bush? No, I think we're sort of in agreement here that I don't question that Trump was a drag on Republicans, right? What I was simply pointing out was in the late stages of this campaign, right, I think he made a difference in terms of mobilizing his base, right, and that helped to stem losses for Republicans.
Thank you.
Yeah, Becker?
Thank you for all the insightful information and for coming. My question is, how can changes in the economy, given the election results from last night, impact the 2020 elections, given the Democrats' control of the House and the Republican control of the Senate?
So I'll take a particular take on it, and it's based on the work of Larry Bartels, political scientist, who has argued, I think convincingly, that on average, Republicans tend to have better economies in their fourth year of office than their first 3 years of office. And it has to do with differences in the parties and how they do economic policy. the fact that actually Trump is seeing good numbers, good economic numbers now, may not suit him well in the fourth year when he's running for re-election, because it just may flatten out, or it may even tail off a little bit. Probably not likely. It's not likely to dive, but it could go down a little bit or be flat. Then he doesn't get the extra points of having the economy pushing forward. If it continues to be good, right, the economy just continues to plow forward, the Republicans only benefit from that, and strongly, right? I mean, this is reminiscent of Reagan in '84 being able to just say, things are going well, everyone's better off. It becomes a harder push for Democrats to fight that at that point.
I just have a question to ask you. You keep talking about the importance of the economy.
Yeah.
And normally, I would say, yes, I understand that. I saw a couple of excerpts last night where they were questioning people on what were the main issues, and healthcare was higher than concern about the economy. Is that an anomaly? Is that maybe, are they related in some way? So,
I have a quick response to that. It's the fact that they're not talking about the economy is what's significant there, right? That the economy is not on people's minds, right? And so it's not hurting the incumbent party, right? So healthcare is the thing that people are thinking about precisely because the economy is not a problem for them. So, okay.
Yeah, I think the other surprising thing is, given the economic numbers we have right now, the president's approval should be well over 50%. It's not. And I think that has to do with his personality, the way he's governing. Well, I should say more with his personality, as opposed, because a generic Republican with an economy that looked like this, you would think their approval rating would be, well over 50%.
So what do you guys make of the fact, if anything, that there were 3 really deeply red states that passed Medicaid expansion last night? Utah, Idaho, and Nebraska. Make anything of it?
Well, I actually think that healthcare is one of these interesting policy areas that is both about something very specific in terms of people's individual lives and their families and taking care of themselves. And it's also now, since really the Affordable Care Act, at least since then, but probably even before that, it's also going back to some earlier conversations, it's also sort of a cultural sort of split. So it depends on, it's sort of the standard thing that I've heard is, if you ask people, in particular Republicans, if they support the Affordable Care Act, they tend to say yes. And if you say, well, do you support Obamacare? They say no. It's the same thing, right? But there's sort of the ways in which healthcare policy is partly part of a larger cultural sort of narrative and fight between the two sides. That is distinct from the actual policy stuff that people care about, like Medicaid, for example, and expanding that.
Yeah, back here.
What does the Senate map look like for the Democrats in 2020?
The Senate?
Yeah, the Senate map.
So the map is arguably favorable to the Democrats because 2/3 of the seats up are Republican-held seats. But then if you look at the vote margins in a lot of those seats from the previous election, those are arguably, most of the Republican seats are very safe seats. So there aren't a lot of, at least based on history, there aren't a lot of really vulnerable Republican senators. Whereas even though the Democrats have a third of the seats, there are actually a fair number of those are fairly close races in the last election. That's my recollection anyway. So this was a tough year for Democrats. Next time around, arguably a tough year for Republicans, but not completely clear that it'll be all that tough for them.
Could the panel address money? That is, clearly in the last 5 to 10 years, we've had lots of attention to the impact of of money on state and federal election things and policy. What did we see last night and your forecast for what will happen in 2020?
Looking at me.
Looking at you.
Well, it's a very broad question you're asking, first of all. I think that Democrats' ability to raise a bunch of money this year was helpful in them managing to take over the House of Representatives. Unless you reach a certain threshold of being able to raise, say, $3 million to run a House race, then you don't have any shot of defeating an incumbent. And the fact that so many Democratic candidates could raise that $3 million at least gave them a fighting chance in some of those races. And of the number of Democratic candidates who were able to outraise Republican incumbents and raise, multi-millions of dollars was much, much, much more than we've seen in previous midterms. I don't know if that's getting at your question, but I think money matters, but it's not all.
Go ahead, John.
So I have another sort of factoid about money. So one place where money, I think, in Washington State was really important was in the initiative process this time around. So you had the gun control initiative, right, was backed by a lot of money, and then there was a lot of money against the carbon initiative and that sort of thing. But one of the things I heard about, I believe it was the gun control initiative, was that they were paying signature gatherers twice as much as signature gatherers had historically received for getting signatures on the ballot. And that had a substantial impact on the ability of other groups or organizations that wanted to get initiatives on the ballot, because they couldn't find anybody, right, who would try to find people to sign their lists, right? Or someone would walk around with 3 initiatives, and the first one they were handing out, right, was the one where they were going to get paid $14 per signature, and the other ones were at the bottom, right? So it'll be interesting to see that dynamic in the future and how that impacts what kinds of initiatives are actually able to get on the ballot. Money has really become an important part.
So I'm kind of curious how the money's getting spent, and I don't know if you if you know this, Travis. I mean, do you see any trends in terms of advertising? Is there a lot more money spent on social media as opposed to traditional media? Was there any trends in the content of advertising you're picking up?
Well, everyone says television is dead, right? Except there were more TV ads aired in these congressional elections than any congressional election in the past. And part of that is just the expanded playing field. Part of it is there was so much money involved that the candidates and outside groups were able to raise. They're definitely spending more money on digital than they were in the past, but for Senate races, it's maybe on average about 10% for those competitive Senate races, a little bit less in the House races. So there has been some shift toward digital advertising, but it's still not, the giant that some people predicted it was going to be.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of curious, if we're talking about 2020 and trying to forecast out that far, if you're the Democratic Party, what do the elections last night, the results, say about what candidate the party might put up in 2020? Is it someone that can, to the first question we had, draw in more moderates and not focus so much on the progressive side? Or do they still have weight that a progressive candidate could still win in 2020, saying that it is going to be? Obviously, probably too early to tell.
My initial reaction is that it says not much at all.
Beto or O'Rourke? I don't know in terms of candidates. I'm much the same. It's not we'll know more in about 3 months than we know now. Is my sense in terms of just how things are sort of settling out. But an immediate response to that is like it could go about any direction.
This young man in here.
Regarding last year's election, do you guys think if Bernie Sanders would have gotten the nomination for the Democratic Party, he could have possibly put up a better chance against Donald Trump?
Now you gotta go back and see it. You wanna take that one?
You referred to question.
Yeah, the question was, would Bernie Sanders have won in 2016 if he was the Democratic nominee? And the political scientist in me who has taught the median voter theorem says absolutely not. The political scientist in me who was chastened by Trump's election in 2016 says sure. People hated Hillary Clinton. A lot of people hated Hillary Clinton. There was a lot of sexism involved there. I think a generic Democrat would have done better than Hillary Clinton in 2016. I don't know.
Speaking of sexism, let me ask you a specific question about the polls. One place where the polls seemed to be off more than elsewhere was in Florida. And I'm thinking in particular, not only was Gillum supposed to win, but he was supposed to do better than Bill Nelson. But Bill Nelson's done markedly better than Gillum. Is that hidden racism playing there?
It's hard to say. It could be just, the events that occurred the last week of the campaign, the FBI investigation, and those things that dominate the news. You got some negativity there, and that can affect people as they're making up their minds. The other thing is, yes, the polls on average said he was going to win, but his loss was within the margin of error as well. So I don't think the polls were that off in Florida.
I mean, I'll play devil's advocate here. If you're a racist, are you going to, how are you going to respond to the poll? And is that going to lead to a bias in the poll results? Right? And I think it's a real possibility. So I do think it's possible that racism had something to do with that.
Yeah.
Are we talking about the renegade journalist Project Veritas? Yeah, he got on camera, I think, one of the staffers for Gillum saying a bunch of racist stuff. Is that what we're talking about?
No, I hadn't heard about
Yeah, it was
that.
just a couple days before the midterm polling. So I think it could have really had an effect there.
Okay, got time for one last question? Yeah.
These are practical advice on Thanksgiving, on polarization. Is this going to make polarization, is the result going to decrease it or increase it? Where is it going, polarization or growth? As a consequence of this outcome?
Are we more polarized or less polarized?
That's
I think we're deeply more polarized,
Yes.
and for lots of reasons. One is most of the moderate Republicans who were left had got wiped out, and you're going to see the Freedom Caucus, for instance, in the House is going to pick up probably 10 seats at least. So you're going to have a much more conservative party in the House than you've had in the past. I think also having a divided government, is going to increase the heat in the rhetoric. So I think you're going to see stalemate and both sides blaming the other side. We're going to have 2 years of that. So I think we're in for more polarization over the next 2 years, is my sense. But maybe somebody else wants
I
to
think
chime
it's
in.
incredibly difficult. So to make policy, you have to compromise, right? There's no way around it. And I think in both parties right now, right, the incentives for people to compromise is non-existent. It's just really, your voters don't want you to compromise, and so how do you get to move beyond that? I don't see that.
Okay, well, I think our time is up. Join me now in thanking our panelists for a really